So I just want to thank everyone so much for coming today. My name is Tina Gelsomino. I'm the Senior Director at the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where we strive to create an inclusive environment for faculty, trainees, and students. We're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Hasan Jeffries here today, and there's going to be more introductions for him shortly, but I did just want to go over a few logistics before we start. So please, next slide. So this is just a quick disclaimer about views, about the presentation. Also to let you know that this isn't a webinar format, and this format is being used to prevent unexpected interruptions, but we want your voice to be heard. So if you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A chat function, and we will make sure your questions get answered. This event will also be recorded and live captioned as well. Next slide, please. I just want to take a moment to thank the Black Project in Boston for helping put all of these events together. They have an amazing list of curated events from across the city for Black History Month, and we've been fortunate to be able to collaborate with this group. I also want to just give a quick shout out to Rochelle Levy-Christopher, who's the executive director there, and she also created the artwork and the background for these slides. So just want to then just say thank you for putting this together and for her artistry and the images you see here. Next slide. Just also want to give a shout out to the People's Heart Project led by Dr. Dan Chande, who is here as well. And this is all about creating spaces for art and placemaking collaboration, increasing culture and empowerment for underserved patients and communities through art and design. Their website is here at the bottom. And so we just want to say thank you so much to Dan for everything he's done to help us collaborate on the programming for Black History Month. And I also want to say thank you to the Center for Diversity and Inclusion and the Brigham Research Institute, who has also helped collaborate on Black History Month. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Galen Henderson, who is our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer here at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Director of Neurocritical Care. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Henderson.
Thank you very much, Tina. Hello, everyone. It's really great for you to attend this event. This is really a fantastic event today. African-American history is incredibly important. One of the reasons I just want to say that with the history of African Americans, it's a celebration of a people, and throughout the month of February, this has been a process that's vibrant today as it was 85 years ago when Dr. Woodson created it. And it's important because it connects a people to their history and can move us forward. So it's always important to remember our history and to be steeped in tradition. So that's something that's incredibly important to me. I also want to introduce next our leader of our institution here at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Dr. Bob Higgins, who was the former Surgeon in Chief at Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore, Maryland, and as of December of this past year, the president of the Brigham and Women's Hospital and the executive vice president of the Mass General Brigham system. Dr. Higgins.
Thanks, Dr. Henderson. And I want to say what a pleasure it is and an honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries. Dr. Jeffries is an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University, where we both share a great appreciation and honor of having been a professor there as well. He teaches courses on civil rights and Black power movements. He is a native of New York, born in Brooklyn, graduated summa cum laude from Morehouse with a BA in history in 1994. And he's earned a PhD in American history with specialization in African American history from Duke University in 2002. He has been the author of many powerful and impressive articles and publications and papers, often chronicling the history and the experience of the African American life. His current book project, In the Shadow of Civil Rights, examines the Black experience in New York City from 1977 to 93. And it connects key political and cultural events, such as rebellions in South Bronx, to the evolution and implementation of public policies that changed Black communities forever. He also shares his knowledge of African American history and contemporary Black politics with the public through lectures, workshops, op-eds, radio and television interviews. He really is a man for all seasons. He's contributed to several documentary film projects and has really been an extraordinary contributor to things like the PBS documentary, Black America Since Martin Luther King. In the classroom, he has taken pride in opening students' minds to new ways of understanding the past and the present, and ultimately giving us some vision for the future. He really has been a remarkable contributor and has been recognized by organizations like the Ohio State, having received the Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching, the university's highest award for teaching, and the University Arts and Sciences Outstanding Teaching Award as well. Really high praise for Dr. Jeffries and his contributions at the university, in academia, in public consciousness, and really an extraordinary contributor. So it is really our pleasure to welcome such a distinguished speaker on this important day. We want to welcome Dr. Jeffries, and we're really delighted you could join us, and thank you so much.
Well, Dr. Higgins, thank you so much for the kind words of introduction as always, and congratulations on the new position and presidency up there, but it's always good to be in conversation with a fellow Buckeye. I very much appreciate that. And I look forward to the broader conversation that we have. I have a few slides that I want to share with everyone. So if it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, share some thoughts and ideas, and then we'll have some time on the back end to take some questions. As was pointed out earlier, the Q&A function, it has been enabled. And so we will be able to see your questions there. So please feel free to populate that at your convenience. I've titled my remarks for this afternoon as we close out Black History Month 2022, Race and Democracy. Race and Democracy. What the African American past can teach us about the American present. As was said at the top of the hour, African American history really is not just a study of the Black past, but it's a prism through which we can view not only the African American experience, but even and more fundamentally the broader American experience. And so as we bring Black History Month to a close, I thought it would be timely and appropriate to reflect back on the ways in which African American history can help us make sense not only of the American past, but also the American present. I am a historian, and so I want to begin with a little bit of history. In 1873, in Louisiana, in the parish of Grant, in the parish seat of Colfax, an election had occurred in which a coalition of African Americans and white Republicans had retained power. This was a Reconstruction government. So the Civil War was over. This is 1873, 3 years afterwards. Only 3 states, and Louisiana was one of them, remained under a Reconstruction government that was enabled by the votes of African American men. This upset to no end former enslavers, former Confederates, Democrats who were rejected the idea that African American men, that Black folk, could and should vote, despite the fact that the 15th Amendment had already been adopted and ratified in 1870. They were upset that African Americans were able to participate in the political process, and especially upset that they were the decisive votes in these close elections, free and fair, but close elections. And so in April of 1873, they announced publicly that they are forming, these former white Confederates, that they are forming a racial terror group patterned after the Ku Klux Klan that had been formed just 5 years earlier in Pulaski, Tennessee. They formed their own racial terror group, the White League, and they announced that they are marching on the parish courthouse in Colfax. Grant Parish is about 2 hours northwest of New Orleans. That they're going to march on the parish courthouse for the purpose of ousting the duly elected officials. They were going to take over the parish government, and they were going to toss out those elected officials, this coalition of African Americans and white Republicans. Well, when a group of former Black soldiers, former Union soldiers, African American men, heard about the plans of the White League, they grabbed their guns, they grabbed their Union Army issue weapons, and made their way to the parish courthouse with the purpose of not only defending the African American and white elected officials, but with the purpose of defending democracy. These were duly elected office holders, and they were determined to see that they held on to their offices and were not run out by this terror group. Well, not long after they arrived at the parish courthouse, that group of white men, armed white men, the White League, along with a mob of white citizens from Grant Parish and elsewhere, arrived. This is April of 1873. Some words are exchanged. The Black men who had taken up defensive positions around the parish courthouse refused to surrender, and a gun battle ensues. 3 white men are shot and killed. Several of the African American defenders of democracy are wounded. And it's not too long before those Black men realize, and we're talking about 150 or so, Black men realize that they are both outnumbered and outgunned. And that the only way that they are going to survive this is if they surrender. And so they make that tough decision, that tough choice. They come out of their defensive positions. They leave the parish courthouse. But when they come out and when they lay down their arms saying, okay, you know, you've won this battle, every single one of those Black men is shot and killed on the spot. And those Black men who had been wounded in the initial exchange of gunfire, they are dragged out of the parish courthouse, and each of them is lynched on the spot. In all, 150 African American men, at least, are massacred that day in what would become known as the Colfax Massacre. Because the national government, the federal government, was still under Republican control, Ulysses S. Grant, Republican president, who was furious when word reaches him that once again, racial terrorists, former Confederates, those traitors to the nation, had infringed upon, through the use of violence, the basic civil rights and human rights of African Americans. He sends troops down into Colfax, into Grant Parish. He stops the violence, so there's no additional violence, and you actually have several arrests, and 9 people are convicted of violating the 14th Amendment, the basic civil rights of African Americans. But the Supreme Court, in a famous ruling, a tragic ruling, in fact, in the decision United States versus Cruikshank, sets aside those convictions, saying that the 14th Amendment did not apply to the actions of individuals or to the actions of state governments, but only to the actions of the federal government. And since these Black men who lost their lives trying to defend democracy were killed by state actors, individual actors, as well as state actors, and not by agents of the federal government, then therefore no violation of the 14th Amendment had occurred. In the end, no one would be held accountable for the massacre that occurs in Colfax in 1873. 75 years later, at the site of the Colfax massacre, Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, erects a historic marker. And I just want to share, it's just 32 words, and I just want to share with you what this marker, this historic marker says. This is 1950. It says, it's titled Colfax Riot. On this site occurred the Colfax Riot, in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Now, the reason why I wanted to share this marker with you, because this marker in these simple 32 words really encapsulates what we as Americans do when we are confronted with what I call, what I shared last time I was with you, hard history. Those aspects of our past that make us uncomfortable in the present. And one of the ways in which we respond to hard history, like the Colfax massacre, this slaughter of 150 Black men who were trying to defend democracy, is that we just make stuff up. We create false narratives. And we see that even in the way this historic marker is titled, this event is titled. It was a massacre, but here it's called a riot, as though there was some equivalency on the part of the two sides, as though the victims of racial terrorism in this instance were somehow culpable, if not responsible, for their own deaths. So that's one of the things we do. We just make up these false narratives. The other thing that we do, and we see it right here in this wording, is that we try to rationalize away the evil. We try to rationalize away the evil. And here we have a massacre. 150 people are murdered. But that second sentence is the rationalization. This event marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. The rationalization, justification is that these Black men had to be murdered in order to prevent the continuation of political corruption that was supposedly the hallmark of these Reconstruction governments. That's a part of the lost cause mythology, that when African Americans are empowered following the Civil War, that they don't know what to do, and political corruption runs rife throughout these southern states, and which is all a fiction and a fabrication. But here, by saying that this event, this slaughter marked the end of carpetbag misrule, then you're actually turning the assailants, those who were trying to undermine democracy, into the defenders of democracy, right? Again, providing a rationalization for this massacre, for this murder. Now, why on earth am I starting by talking about an event that happens 150 years or so ago, and then a marker that proceeds 75 years after that? Because you can draw a straight line from what occurred in Colfax in 1873 and the attempted insurrection that occurred in January of 2021. The attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power from one presidency to the next. That was shocking for all to see, myself included. We all should have been shocked by this because we've never seen anything like this before in American history. But we should not have been surprised by it, because there is this longer history. There are precedents for the use of this kind of political violence in America. Not only do we see it in Colfax in 1873, but we see it in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, the Wilmington Massacre. We see it, we just marked the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, which is focused on an African-American economic business community, but undergirding that was a desire to keep African-Americans from participating in the political process. The violence and racial terrorism of the 1950s and 1960s designed to keep African-Americans from regaining the right to vote. There is a long history of this kind of political violence, but the connection isn't just the examples. the connection is actually much deeper, because when we think about what motivated this mob of people to attempt to stop that peaceful transfer of power, to storm the Capitol, to beat police, waving the sort of the flags of the Confederacy, and wearing neo-Nazi white supremacist paraphernalia and the like, what was motivating them was the big lie that was offered by the former president of the United States. This idea that the election of November, in the 2020 presidential election, was somehow stolen out from under him. Now he begins to perpetuate and set this up, lay the groundwork for this before the first ballot is even cast. And of course, there's no evidence whatsoever to support these accusations. We, in fact, in the middle of a pandemic, had without dispute the freest and fairest election that we have ever probably had in United States history. But it didn't matter. The evidence of that didn't matter, because the lie resonates with that faction of the former president's supporters who were most animated by Donald Trump's appeals to white supremacy. And this is, we're at the moment in time now where we just have to speak frankly about what it is that Donald Trump was trading in. Donald Trump may not know much, but he certainly understood that racism is the most powerful political organizing tool that America has ever created. And racism, organizing around racism, animated a group of the white electorate that had been sitting on the sidelines, that served as the difference makers in the 2016 election, and that are the ones who will be most animated, most energized, and who will show up on January 6th in this attempt to storm the nation's capital. But it's more than just sort of a vague kind of racism. It was a very specific kind of racism that we see the roots of which in events like we saw in Colfax, because Donald Trump wasn't just saying that the election had been stolen in general. He was saying that the election had been stolen in very specific places, that the fraud had occurred in Atlanta, Georgia. The fraud had occurred in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The fraud had occurred in Milwaukee. The fraud had occurred in Detroit. The fraud had occurred where Black people participated in the political process. And that resonates, that becomes believable, despite all evidence to the contrary, because the idea that Black people not only participating in the political process, but serving as the decisive votes in an election, in the minds of so many, renders that election illegitimate. And this is what Donald Trump was preying on. And that goes directly back to that history, what we saw in Colfax in 1873, what we would see in Wilmington in 1898. So we could and should have been shocked by what we saw on January 6th, but there is no way that we should have been surprised because of this long history of political violence, racialized political violence in America. Aside from the fact that America was born of political violence. That's what the American Revolution was. That's what the Boston Tea Party was. And America was almost split in half because of political violence. That's what the Civil War was. Fast forward 1 year from 2021 to 2022, and the current president of the United States, Joe Biden, delivers a very powerful speech on the anniversary of that attempted insurrection, that failed insurrection. He gives a very powerful speech, and I was listening. I was sitting there watching, glued to the television, as I'm sure many of you were as well. And he's talking about, in very stark terms, what this was. This was an attempt to undermine the democratic processes here in the United States, to stop that peaceful transfer of power, in very bold and very strong language, which was great to hear. But then he says, what we saw on January 6th, this attempt to use political violence, that this is not us. This is not who we are. And at that moment, the historian in me was like, are you sure, Mr. President? Because history says something completely different. And that is so important, because it's not enough simply to look to create this sort of fictive past and say, you know, well, we saw something bad in the present, and that's really not who. No, that's exactly who we are. And this is important that we understand that. So we're not surprised when we see white supremacists rallying around an authoritarian like figure, somebody who aspires to these authoritarian like aspects, because we know that this has been a nation that has promoted white supremacy publicly and officially for the vast majority of its time as a nation. So, you know, is this who we are? Yes. And why does that matter when we look at history? Because the great author and philosopher James Baldwin put it best when he said, we are our history. Not just Black folk or Black history. We are our collective history. As Americans, we are American history. And unless we understand that history in its truest sense, unless we lean into those aspects that make us uncomfortable, that we don't want to, that we wish didn't happen, then we can't understand who we are in the present. We are our history. And when it comes to this question of the intersection of race and democracy, that history, who we are, is not recent. It's not new. It literally goes back to the very beginning. And so this is where, you know, as a historian, you know, we've been talking, and historians in general, we've been talking about the date 1619. We've been talking about that for decades, right? I mean, it's a date. 1619 is the date, the year that 20 and odd enslaved Africans are bought on the coast of Virginia, marking the moment where slavery reaches the British American colony. 1619, it's a date. I don't know why people, I was about to say white people, then I changed it to people, but we were talking about white people. I don't know why white people are losing their mind over 1619, a date. Allen Iverson, Hall of Fame basketball player, he'd be like, practice? We talking about practice. We talking about a date. Why are you losing your mind over a date? Because that date is meaningful. That date is meaningful because that's a choice that is being made by these Virginia colonists that would set America on a trajectory of what democracy would look like, and who it would who would be allowed to participate in that democracy. Because in 1619, we see the coming together of racism and capitalism. We think about America's DNA, if you will, the double helix of America's DNA, the two strands are racism and capitalism. Those two combined give us 250 years of slavery. Racism and capitalism combined, intertwined, will give us another 100 years of Jim Crow. And they'll give us another 50 years, 40 years of mass incarceration connected to the war on drugs. We cannot understand America without understanding the intersection of racism and capitalism, and the two cannot be separated. And that has folk losing their mind, because that is the conversation that you have to understand the trajectory and evolution of America if you are serious about understanding the contours of it and the truth that stands behind it. But they don't want to deal with 1619. They don't want to deal with that. They don't want to deal with that intersection and the choices that American colonists are making. And so they want to fool around and say, well, let's not talk about 1619, let's talk about 1776. And the former president of the United States in September of 2020, on his way out the office, launches this 1776 a commission and talk about, we need patriotic education. We don't need to talk about 1619. We need to talk about the framers and the founders, and everything else is creating these divisive issues. Now, look, this is all nonsense, right? 1776 silliness is nonsense. But it's important because it serves literally as the blueprint for all of the legislation coming out of state legislatures that we would see in the next year of 2020 that are limiting what teachers can teach about the American past, saying we're not going to teach about divisive concepts, questions of race and racism in American society. All of that language comes directly out of, word for word, this 1776 report, if you will, this the president's executive order. I'm happy to talk about 1776. We can talk about 1776. We can talk about the framers and founders. But if we do that, if you want to talk about we the people, if you want to talk about the birth of this nation in the century and a half after 1619 in America's commitment to the colonial commitment to slavery, we can do that. But we have to talk, and I want to, for those who joined us last time, if you want to talk about it, we got to talk about it in an honest way. We got to talk about James Madison, and this is James Madison's plantation estate, fourth president of the United States, the father of the Bill of Rights, the architect of the Constitution. Let's talk about James Madison. This is James Madison who's creating the civil liberties that the government cannot not infringe upon, is also an enslaver. Madison enslaves 100 people over the course of his lifetime, never frees a single soul, not even upon his death. And he was a third generation enslaver. This is what he did for a life, for his livelihood. He held people in bondage, right? And so we have to talk about that. If we're going to talk about the founding, you're going to talk about the founding, you're going to talk about the founders, then you got to talk about who they were. And you can't talk about, as we usually do, we wind up talking about a James Madison or a Jefferson. All men are created equal, did not have to qualify because everybody knew he wasn't talking about women or anybody else but wealthy white men with property and power, right? You want to talk about Jefferson, then you got to talk about the people they're holding in bondage. Over the last couple of years, I've been taking small groups of students from the Ohio State University to James Madison's plantation estate, and we go to that room right in between those two pillars, the library where Madison conceives and conceptualizes the Bill of Rights. And then I take my students there, and then we go down into the basement, and I have them put their hands on these brick walls where you can feel the fingerprints of the enslaved people that made every single brick on that plantation. And those fingerprints are not the fingerprints of adults, but they're the fingerprints of children, because all of those bricks on Madison's plantation were made by the children that he enslaved. So literally, the Bill of Rights is conceived and conceptualized on a foundation of bricks made by the children that the father of the Constitution enslaved for his comfort and convenience. If you want to talk about 1776, we can talk about 1776, but there's no way that you can talk about it honestly without talking about the intimate connection between the founding, racism, and the institution of slavery. There's another thing as we move forward into time, that Americans too often get caught up in. And that is the myth of perpetual progress, especially the myth of perpetual racial progress, that we're willing to acknowledge that at some point, things may have been a little bit worse than they are now, right? Slavery existed, kind of bad, yeah, but you got the Civil War, right? The Civil War happened, you had Reconstruction, Jim Crow, not quite sure what that is, probably a little bit inconvenient, but you got Martin Luther King. War on drugs, not really working out for Black people, but you got Barack Obama, and hell, even got Beyonce, perpetual progress, right? Things always get better. But when you look a little closer at American history, specifically through the lens of the African-American experience, you realize no, things just don't get perpetually better, right? Like you have moments of progress followed by extended periods where things just get worse for Black folk, where democracy contracts rather than expands. Between 1890 and 1910, every state in the former Confederacy calls a convention to rewrite their state constitutions. And this is the session of the Mississippi legislature in 1890 had already run Black folk out of the state legislature. There was only one African American who's pictured here who was left in the state legislature, and every single one of these state these southern states rewrite their state constitution for the sole purpose of disenfranchising African Americans, for the sole purpose of taking the vote away from African Americans, and they are clear about it. They don't hide it. They are literally saying, we're calling a constitutional convention to rewrite our state laws to take the vote away from African Americans. But they cannot do it. They cannot do it by saying explicitly that they don't want Black people to vote, because you have the 14th Amendment and you have the 15th Amendment, which guarantees African American men the right to vote and prohibits discrimination on the basis of race. And so what do? They use colorblind language. Colorblind language with the expressed and explicit intent of targeting African Americans. So this is when we get the poll tax. This is when we get the literacy test. This is when we get felon disenfranchisement, which is still with us today. The state of Virginia, when it has its constitutional convention and rewrites its state constitution at the turn of the 20th century, they include disenfranchisement for anyone who has a felony conviction. To this day, 20% of African Americans in the state of Virginia do not have voting rights because they have a felony conviction. And you can only get your voting rights restored in the state of Virginia if you get a specific letter written restoring them to you from the governor of Virginia. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. And so we're still living with these mechanisms on the books that were designed solely for disenfranchising African Americans. Now, if you're watching this and say, well, you know, that's really unfortunate for Black folk, whenever it is, but it's bigger than that, because whenever you begin to constrict rather than expand or protect democracy, even if you are in the majority group, even if you are white in America, there is going to be some costs that white folk are going to pay. And in this instance, part of those conversations, part of the debate was, if we pass these mechanisms, there are going to be some poor white folk who are going to be disenfranchised too, who don't have the money to pay a poll tax, who are not literate themselves, right? And so they're going to suffer and sacrifice. And this was part of the debate. And you know what the landed aristocracy that was leading this at the time said? Oh, well, everybody got to make sacrifices, right? They were willing to toss their own, right, in order to disenfranchise African Americans. There's always a price to be paid by all members, some members of even the majority group, when you begin to contract democracy. 1954, we have the Brown decision, and most of us, hopefully, you know, we are familiar with the Brown decision, saying that segregation in education is unconstitutional, overturning the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, saying that separate but equal was constitutional. This is important, but here we see as an example that myth of perpetual racial progress. You know, I ask my students when they come in, good students coming to Ohio State University, and they come in and say, okay, Brown says segregation education is unconstitutional, therefore you have to desegregate schools. When does school desegregation occur in the South? And the students, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, like, oh, it must have happened maybe that year. I'm like, no, maybe the next year? No, maybe in a couple years? 10 years, there's nothing happens. Absolute resistance. You have a couple hot spots, but for the most part, 98 to 99% of schools remain segregated 10 years after the Brown decision. One of the things that we have in our minds when we think about sort of race and democracy is this idea that the Supreme Court in particular has always been on the side of Black folk and extending rights. There is a moment, certainly, when the Warren Court, Earl Warren, Chief Justice appointed by Eisenhower, who gets a unanimous decision on the Brown decision. Worst decision that President Eisenhower said he ever made in his political career as president was appointing Earl Warren Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Warren is about protecting and expanding civil rights, although he had a checkered past as governor of California. But that's it when we think about the Supreme Court. I'll say a little bit about something before, but prior to that, the history of the court has been about contracting, restricting basic civil rights and human rights for African Americans, going all the way back to the 1857 and Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Roger Taney saying African Americans have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. We see case after case after case, ruling after ruling, including Plessy, all the way up to Brown, that are working against the interests of African Americans. And so when we get to today, and we'll get to today in a second, and you see the Supreme Court working against the best interests of African Americans, working against the best interests of democracy, we should not, again, be surprised because we know a little Black history. There is a revolution that occurs, and Brown is a part of that revolution. But the political revolution, when we're thinking about democracy, really takes place in 1965, when African Americans are finally able to secure new voting rights protections and through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But with every revolution, when we think about democracy in America, comes a counter-revolution. And we see that counter-revolution in the form of the construction or the reorientation of the Republican Party. It begins with Nixon in 1968, who initiates this Southern strategy in which he is appealing to the most racist elements of the Democratic Party that had, as the Democratic Party had alienated them by embracing, Lyndon Johnson, of course, is a Democrat, by embracing a civil rights platform. Richard Nixon says, no, we welcome you, right? Racist white Southerners, like racist white suburbanites into our party. And this revolution really comes to a head in 1980 when then governor at the time, Ronald Reagan, launches his presidential campaign. Governor of California launches his presidential campaign, not in California, not in DC, not in New York, but in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Neshoba County, Mississippi, middle of nowhere, Mississippi. He formally announces his campaign in Neshoba County, Mississippi, and specifically in Philadelphia. Why? Why does he do that? Because Neshoba County, Mississippi, Philadelphia, is the site where 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, were murdered by the police in collusion with the Klan in 1964. Ronald Reagan goes there specifically to begin his presidential campaign because he is signaling to that racist core of white Southerners that used to be in the Democratic Party that they are welcome in the Republican Party. Racism is the most powerful political organizing tool that America has ever created, and the GOP has been trading on this for the last 50 years. There's nothing that the former President Donald Trump is doing that his predecessors weren't doing before. The language certainly may have changed a little bit. We got a little used to some of the quieter dog whistles, but there's a deep, long history of it, and we have to acknowledge that. I had a student, good white kid, in my class at Ohio State. And I was telling him we were talking about, Reagan launching his political campaign here. And the students he just didn't want to accept it, right? Couldn't believe it. It's like, wait, Ronald Reagan, no, I know about Reagan. No, he wouldn't do that. He said, Dr. Jeffries, are you sure that that's why he was there, right? That refusal to accept, right? That purposeful historical amnesia was at play. And I had to turn to him. I said, well, what do you think? His campaign bus was on the way to California and just broke down in Neshoba County, Mississippi. And he was like, well, maybe this is as good a place as any to launch my, no, he was there because he knew the symbolic meaning and who he was appealing to. That on the deaths of those who were fighting for basic civil rights and political rights for African Americans, he was going to make his appeal to white Southerners. Racism, the most powerful political organizing tool that America has ever created. But rather than leaning into and understanding the important way in which race and racism continue to have shaped the contours of American life, but continue to shape the contours of American life, too often we fall into the colorblind trap, and we see that playing out, especially being used by the political conservatives to undermine efforts to actually expand democracy and bring about a greater sense of equality, greater freedom for marginalized groups. And so in 2007, John Roberts, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the Roberts Court, he rules in the case Parents Involved versus Seattle, a case in Seattle where the school district in Seattle wanted to maintain a desegregation plan voluntarily, right? This is not a court-imposed one. The school district's like, no, we want to keep this. This is working. And then you have a white parents like, no, we think that's unfair. And Roberts writes in that opinion, overturning Seattle's ability. Louisville does the same thing to maintain sort of race in pupil placement. And he writes, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, which sounds really nice, but it's just nonsense, right? It's nonsense. If racism, using race to create inequality, is the source of the problem, then you cannot ignore race when trying to come up with a solution. Pretending as though it does not matter does not create a solution, is not an effective solution to the problem. And he knows that, but they're playing with this language. Oh, any mention of race is discriminatory. That's ridiculous. It's one thing to discriminate against people on the basis of race. It is something totally different to attempt to remedy the effects of racism by saying, no, we are going to concentrate efforts in this with this particular group and in this particular way. So he falls into the colorblind trap. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in what will arguably be her most important dissent while she was on the court in 2013 in the case of Shelby versus Holder, speaks to this problem in the broader political context when she writes in her dissent, as the Supreme Court is undermining the Voting Rights Act, pulling out the teeth that are in it to keep Southern legislatures and and states in general from passing discriminatory measures that make it harder for African Americans and others to vote. She writes, throwing out the Voting Rights Act when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. She's saying, like, look, if it's working, and then you look like, okay, more Black people are voting, and you're like, okay, if there more Black people are voting, then we no longer need these protections, and you remove the protections. That doesn't make any sense. The protections are why more Black people are able to vote, are able to have political representation. It's what is saving democracy. It's what's expanding democracy. And then you remove the umbrella, and now you're wondering, why you're getting wet. This was the floodgates. The floodgates are open, and so we should not be surprised when we see the flood. And the flood we begin to see is building immediately after Shelby, but then the water really begins to rush in January of 2021 when we see states like Georgia passing a wave of voter suppression laws. Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Texas, a wave of voter suppression laws, making it more difficult for people to participate in the political process. That is fundamentally undemocratic. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you find yourself, any efforts that are designed to limit the vote, especially when you're using race to justify it and racism to justify it, is fundamentally undemocratic. America does not have a voting fraud problem. Americans don't vote. Right? There's nobody rushing to the polls trying to impersonate and vote 3-4 times. We can't even get them to vote one time. Right? The percentage of Americans who vote is paltry. Right? And so we should be doing everything in our power to make it easier for people to participate in the political process. And that's what we saw in those efforts during the election of 2020, when it was easier for people to vote, even in the middle of a pandemic, making access to absentee ballots and drop box, making it easy. We saw more people participate in the political process, and that scared the devil out of those who benefit from maintaining the status quo, making it harder for people to participate in the political process. And we are being overwhelmed by the flood now. And then you have the flood, but you got to justify the flood and opening the floodgates. And so then you get the foolishness, all this, the critical race theory hysteria. White parents run around talking about, we don't want little Kylie learning about racism. It's going to make her uncomfortable. What the hell are you talking about? You know what's uncomfortable? Being enslaved to President James Madison and making bricks as a 5-year-old or 6-year-old for his comfort and convenience. You know what's uncomfortable? Being a 6-year-old child in New Orleans, Ruby Bridges, and being yelled at and screamed at by parents and adults. And that's what you're afraid of talking about, right? You don't want your little child to know that grandma was on the wrong side of history. But with James Baldwin, the only way that we can understand who we are is if we understand our history. We are our history. So we have to stop playing around, playing these silly games. It ain't about shame or blame. Nobody is blaming little white kids today for the problems of the past or the present. They're not responsible for that. They're not responsible for yesterday. They're not responsible for today. But our children are absolutely responsible for tomorrow. And it is our duty as parents and as educators to prepare them for tomorrow. And we can't prepare them for tomorrow, give them the tools that they need to address the problems that we are leaving before them if we run around with this foolishness and pretend that the past never happened. I'll leave you with this word. Dr. King used to talk about the arc of the moral universe. You say the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And that is, those are comforting words for many. Because if the arc is always bending towards justice, then perhaps we don't have to do anything. Perhaps we can just allow time to proceed. If enough time passes, then we will get to that point of justice. But see, that's the myth of perpetual progress, right? No, time is not a social force capable of creating change. Time is just a unit of measure. What Dr. King was saying, you can go back to this 1963 letter from Birmingham jail. He says the arc of the moral universe is long and will bend towards justice only if you have people who are willing to exert the force necessary to bend it in that direction. And in the summer of 2020, we saw millions of young people taken to the streets for the sole purpose of bending that arc towards justice. 20 to 30 million young people taken to the streets in June of 2020 alone. That we need to rally behind. Now that scared the heck out of some people, right? That's why we got all this systemic racism ain't real stuff, right? When they were demanding an end to systemic racism. But that act, that force, that willingness to bring about change, willingness to demonstrate, not only for the victims of police violence, but to say we need to bring an end to systemic racism, that will bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. And so when we look to the future, we got to look to the young people of today, because they're the ones who are willing to exert that force. They get it. And they're also the ones who are responsible in the future for shaping the future. And we need to do our part to make sure they have the tools that are necessary to do so. This democracy is fragile. There's no guarantee that this democracy will survive. It's young and it's in its infancy. We got to acknowledge that. I hesitate to say this, but it is true. Right now, we are living with two political parties that aren't debating policy anymore. You have one party, the Democrats, that want to debate policy. The other party is not debating policy. It does not see democracy as being worthy of protection. If it did, it wouldn't be trying to do away with the voting rights of African Americans. They're not trying to protect democracy. They see democracy as the problem. They see democracy as the problem. And these white supremacists, that's why they're gravitating towards that political party, because they understand that the greatest threat to white supremacy in America is a multiracial democracy. But we don't understand that the greatest threat to a multiracial democracy is white supremacy. And we need to. Otherwise, we're going to lose what we have. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'll turn it back over to the good folk who are in charge. Dr. Henderson.
Dr. Jeffries, that was amazing. Thank you very much. Very informative, very, very helpful. And I want to thank you for such a great talk. I want to turn things over to some of the questions that we have in our Q&A section. One of the first questions is, can you conjecture the Flint water crisis may be viewed in the same way, similar to the Colfax, where no one is held accountable? And what lessons can we learn from that?
Yeah, no, that's a great, we can learn a lot from what happened in Flint. And one of the things that we can learn from Flint is, how did it happen? How did the local government lose authority and control? Because this was, again, democracy. When you have a political party that is saying democracy is the problem, you have administrators, the power to control the daily decision making in Flint, Michigan was taken over by a Republican Republican legislature, Republican governor, who then put in his own people and administrated. They lost local control, and then they were like, "Oh, let's just change the water supply. Let's change where we're getting the water from." In other words, that whole thing is a reflection of an effort of people to lessen the democratic participation of its citizens, and it has proved disastrous. So one, how it came about is problematic, but then the response too, right? Pretending as though what we are seeing is somehow a natural disaster. It's a man-made, a human disaster, and not doing what was necessary to rectify it, right? Like, we owe the people and the young people and the adults of Flint, Michigan, whatever it is that we as a nation can do to rectify the situation, build up the infrastructure, but also provide the assistance that they need going forward. So there's a direct connection. And the fact that this was a mostly Black and poor white community, right, deindustrialized over the years, plays a role in how that messaging gets made and how we empathize as a nation with those who were the victims of that crisis. So no, I think it's a function of the failure of democracy, but not just by accident, but by a particular kind of planning that was designed to limit the ability of local people to have a say in the decisions that affected their lives.
Next question. So there has what we learned from your lecture this afternoon, false narratives, rationalizations. Um, how do we not fall for this? Because it seems like every so many years we slide back, as you said.
Yeah. So it's not easy. One, this is why it's so, education as an educator, it's so critically important that we constantly tell the truth. We constantly shine a light on on what actually has happened in the past, right? And how it is impacting the present. So education is critical, but education in and of itself is not enough. And we're actually in Dr. Henderson, we're really in a dangerous moment right now. My brother is a lawyer. I'm a historian. We grew up debating and arguing. We still debate for no good reason whatsoever. We argue and debate about stuff, and we'll debate about anything. But he's like me. The one area we do not debate with anybody really is religion. We don't debate religion, right? Why? Because religion is belief in the absence of fact. So there's really not much that I can say to you that may sway you off your belief. We can discuss and interpret, biblical texts. We can discuss and interpret Talmudic texts and the like. But it's faith. It's faith. Religion, belief in the absence, faith, belief in the absence of fact. This is what we're dealing with now in the realm of politics. This is what we're dealing now in the realm of science and the COVID vaccine, the COVID-19 the vaccine, right? Like it's not about facts. It's belief in the absence of fact. And when that's the case, I don't know how you have honest and frank conversation. I don't know how you compromise. And that's the challenge. So in a way, this isn't about sort of, you got to have the education, but this isn't about sort of finding common ground. You have to exercise power and authority, right? Like if you have, y'all are scientists, y'all get this, right? It's like, okay, two people can interpret a set of data differently, but you can't have your own set of data, right? Like you can't just make up data and say, I'm going to throw this in here, right? Because it won't work. The outcome will be flawed. And that's what we're dealing with. And so, yes, we have to continue to speak truth. We have to continue to talk about the past honestly and frankly, but we also have to call out those who are not dealing with reality, who are saying things not based upon fact, who interpreted things not based upon fact, because we see the dire consequences of that. We see the dire consequences of that over the last 2 years, as almost 1 million people have died during this pandemic in the United States, because we're not willing to deal with facts. So it's a challenge. It is a real challenge. We have to speak the truth, but we also have to accept sometimes that, you know what, we're going to have to flex some muscles here, pass some laws, and do some policy making decisions to make sure that everyone is everyone is safe and protected.
Great. Dr. Jeffries, thank you so much for your talk this afternoon. It's really been great. We've been blessed by some great words. I want to thank everyone who was able to attend this Black History event. I also want to thank Dr. Higgins for hosting this event and his national leadership in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would also like to thank Don Chunde for the People's Heart and his leadership in planning the Black History Month, and to thank the Black Project, from which they've helped tremendously with amplifying Black History Month events around the city of Boston. Thank you very, very much, everyone.